Welcome, everyone. I'm Gary Locklair. I'm professor of computer science here at Concordia University, Wisconsin, your host institution. I'm the very last presenter at our 10th annual conference, and it's probably a good idea that I'm bringing up the rear here. I've taught for a number of years, as you can tell by my gray hair. I am a member of the Creation Research Society. I've served on their board of directors for 25 years. I'm also a fellow of the Creation Research Society. And what I would like to do is we've had some wonderful presentations. I said this earlier too. These have just been outstanding, as they are most years. But I'd like to take a slightly different approach with you today. We've had a lot of heavy-duty science. And my friends Zeb and Zeke are heavy-duty scientists. And as Zeb was boiling some water in a beaker for an experiment, he said, "Rest in peace, boiling water." Zeke chimed in, "You will be missed." See, science isn't so scary. Our theme for this 10th annual conference is the origin of diverse kinds of life. But how did all the diversity of life get here? Did it come here naturally via a mechanistic process that we oftentimes call evolution? Or was it programmed supernaturally via creation? Everybody has the same data, the same facts. There's enormous diversity of life on planet Earth. But the question is, where did it come from? Well, as we'll see, and as we have seen, God created kinds which could diversify. He likely also created many different members of a kind. I don't know, does it make sense to you that on day 6 of creation, God created just 2 dogs, or 2 lions, or 2 of the dog kind, 2 of the cat kind? Does it make sense to you that on day 5, he created just 2 rainbow trout, or 2 blackbirds? He certainly could have done that. But if we read carefully, Genesis 1, chapter 20, and God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heaven." The King James renders this abundantly. The NIV says team. So it could well be that in addition to the kind that God created, he made a number of members of that kind. What are we talking about? How did this work? What would a scientist like myself say is the mechanism for how God created the diversity of life? There are 2 things that are important to keep in mind. In the beginning, there were different kinds of life, and those kinds of life were ready to run. I put it this way: God created each kind of life distinctly, that is, separately from other kinds. And those kinds were fully formed and functional. They were ready to run. Now, there's another aspect here. So here is the creation week. What about since the creation week? There is a diversity of life after the creation. See, God established genetic variability within a kind. Our offspring are not exactly like us, and the offspring of any kind of life is not exactly like the parents. That's for beauty, part of God's soul, and also for survival of the kinds that we'll discuss later. So change is possible. Change within a kind is predicted and is part of the creation model. Sometimes people associate change with evolution. And evolution certainly means change, but change is possible within the creation model also. But the change in our model in creation is the diversity within a kind, not changing from one kind to another. So let's review. The diversity of life, all the different kinds of life that we see today, really have 2 sources. First of all, there were different original created kinds. There was a dog kind. There was a cat kind. Dr. Jeanson brought up his laser pointer. I should do that too. See, there's a dog kind and there's a cat kind. Now, the dog kind probably doesn't look like any dogs or any canine that we look at and understand today. Maybe same with the cat kind. In addition to two, a male and a female, could God have created other members of the dog kind and cat kind? Of course, we don't know. Now, second source of diversity is differences arrive over generations of offspring. When the original dog kind had babies, they don't look exactly like their parents. Same for the cat kind. They don't look exactly like their parents. And over many generations, we have lots of diversity appear. But this diversity, the second source, is within the kind itself. The creation model, we think of creation as an orchard. Charles Darwin imagined that all life was interconnected in what he called the branching bush. You start with a simple form of life, which diversifies and changes greatly and radically, and via common descent in millions of years, we have all the different kinds of life today. But the creation ordered is a different and better model. It shows us that each one of these trees is a distinct kind: apple, pear, orange, etc. Now, the analogy breaks down a little bit, but imagine within the pear tree, there could be different varieties of pears. And of course, there can be. So within each of these trees in the orchard, there's variation, variety, but it's limited by the root stock, the basic kind. So creationary scientists will oftentimes draw pictures like this: one tree with the bovine kind, another tree with the equus kind, another tree with X kind and Y kind and Z kind. Lots of variation within finches, but finches are not osprey, and they're certainly not fish or reptiles. As Dr. Heck mentioned, I like to focus on positive creation evidences. There's nothing wrong with pointing out the shortcomings of evolution. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I like to do that, focus on the positive. Why? Quick story. If you ask Dr. Heck, I've done this, what's your favorite baseball team, Dr. Heck? He'll say, the Los Angeles Dodgers. And I'll say, the Dodgers, those bums, that's the stink. Well, immediately, we haven't got off on a very good start, have we? I haven't been very winsome by tearing down his team. I should have said, boy, you know, the Dodgers, they are very good. They've won a number of pennants, but you know what? I really think the San Francisco Giants are a better team. And here's why. So what I'm saying is we'll use positive evidences to interact with the honest skeptic, someone searching and willing to listen to reasonable arguments. Oh, there's a cat. Yeah, that's my honest skeptic. We'll see another one in a little bit. I'm going to share an idea with you called Apologetics CPR. It's an acronym, C, P, and R. I'll show you the source of this because this is really cool, but let's set the stage. 3 steps in apologetics. The first step is clarification. By that, we mean to ask questions to understand what the other person is saying. Somebody comes up to me and says, well, Charles Darwin proved that all life is related via common descent. And I'll ask, interesting, how did he do that? What do you mean by proof? What is common descent? Is that unlimited, or does it apply just to fruit flies? Now, we're not doing this to set anybody up. We're doing this so we truly understand where the other person is coming from. We're having a conversation. That's how we can connect with people, and that's how we can ultimately share the important truths that we have. Now, that's the C, clarification. The P in CPR is positive evidences. Show the other person what's true. They mention Darwin and common descent. We'll say, that's interesting, but can I show you some scientific evidence to show that there are distinct kinds of life? Haven't our presenters done well with that already? And why that points to a creator. The third, the R, is then, if necessary, we will refute. We'll show what's false. We'll say, no, I'm sorry, molecular and other types of baraminology demonstrate unequivocally that these different kinds cannot be related, nor could they be descended over time. So yeah, we can refute, but I think it's a good idea to do that afterwards. Now, I'm pulling this out of this book here. This book is Called to Defend. It was written by, oh, can you see? Yeah, no, can't see the author there. Oh, yes, I know this person. This is my number one daughter, Valerie Locklair III. I would encourage you, if you're interested in apologetics, to look for this book. You can find it in a number of places, including 1517.org, an apologetics organization, 1517.org, and you'll find it at other online bookstores too. Called to Defend, apologetics, great stuff. Here's another Christian apologist of 400 years ago. Blaise Pascal, I have a personal interest in because I consider one of the two grandfathers of computer science. Along with the Lutheran German Wilhelm Schickard, the French Christian scientist Blaise Pascal set the groundwork for computer science. Now, as a deep thinker and philosopher, Pascal thought about argumentation. He thought about apologetics. He said you need to show both sides. I've been blessed to teach a course here in cosmogony at Concordia University, Wisconsin for many years. Cosmogony is the science of origin. And in that class, I spend 1/3 of the class talking about evolution, presenting it from an evolutionary perspective. The next third of the class talking about creation and presenting it from a creationary perspective. Then the last third is when we get to interact and cross-examine. But you must show both sides. And as Pascal said, show what is true before what is false. Here's a little quote. When we wish to correct with advantage, when you want to show somebody else that they're wrong, and to show another that he errs, we must notice from which side he views the matter. For on that side, it is usually true. From his perspective, it is true, and admit that truth to him. But to reveal to him the side on which it is false. Yeah. And Pascal goes on to say, hey, when they see that you accept some aspects of what they say, they're more open to hear what you say also. Sound apologetic advice. Let's apply this to not the grandfather of evolution. Evolution is an extremely old idea. Lucretius, the Roman, about the time of Christ, wrote an entire huge volume on evolution. Greeks talked about evolution for hundreds of years before Jesus was born. But we all know Darwin. In his book on the origin of species, Darwin says a number of different things. One thing he says is, the world is not static, but changing. Things aren't constant, but they change. That's absolutely true. Members of a species change too. Absolutely true. Now, unfortunately, Darwin went on with that. Let me stop. Darwin correctly noted that natural processes can cause change within a kind. That's correct. It's accepted by everyone. But he extrapolated that small scale change to large scale change over time, and between kinds developing new kinds, and that is not correct. So, as some of you know, Chuck Norris is my hero. He's playing the role of the honest skeptic. How do we interact with the honest skeptic? What data can we present to the honest skeptic? The honest skeptic has been bombarded with evolutionary views throughout her life. What are we going to do? How can we discuss origins legitimately with them? Well, first of all, we like to disarm them with a joke. Chuck Norris doesn't read books. He stares them down to get the information he wants. Chuck is the original macho man. His exploits put Superman and Batman to shame. My friend Zeb looks, you know this classic thing, right? My friend Zeb looks at the glass and says, oh, yeah, it's half full. Zeke looks at it and says, no, it's half empty. Chuck Norris looks at it and says, it's completely full, half with water and half with air. And he's right. And see, here's one very important thing to understand about origins and evidence and creation and evolution. We all have the same data. We all live in the same world. We can all uncover the same evidence. It's not the data. It's not the evidence in dispute. It's the interpretation. What do you see when you look at this? Some people see an old woman. Other people see a young girl. What? Now, if you see an old woman, here's her, she's looking down this way. Here's her big nose. Here's her eye. Here's her mouth, and here's her pointed chin. But other people see a young girl. She's turned away from us. She's looking out this way. Here's her dainty nose. Here's her eyelash. Here's her chin, and this is her ear. So it's not the data that's in dispute. It's the interpretation. And those interpretations are colored by the bias we come with that's part of our worldview. Yep, we're all biased. We all come with worldviews to help us interpret the data. But it's important to remember this: creation is reasonable. It's a reasonable idea for origins. Creation is scientifically sensible and it's logically lucid. Let me demonstrate that for you. Now, in this conference, we've seen some great scientific evidence for the origin of diverse kinds of life. Now, if you don't happen to be a PhD molecular biologist, if you don't happen to be Dr. Charhati or Dr. Jeanson, you're saying, how will I ever be able to talk to anybody about this? I can barely understand it myself. Well, let's look at some other evidences, and even the evidences that were already presented. Let's look at it in a straightforward way. Most of us are not going to be interacting with PhD scientists, but we will be interacting with our friends, neighbors, and relatives. So let's find some straightforward, easy to understand evidences that not only we can use if we understand them, but our neighbor can understand them easily also. You know, one of my favorite evidences for creation is the fossils. Fossils, these are so cool. Trilobite, theropod dinosaur print. Fossils are so interesting. I also know fossils are kind of scary. What are fossils? There's the easy question. Fossils are the remains of once living creatures. Now, how can fossils be evidence for creation? Most people think fossils go hand in glove with evolution. No. Fossils are just remains of once living creatures. How they're interpreted is what we're going to investigate. Let me tell you a couple different, at least two evidences dealing with fossils that I think are easy to understand, easy to share. The first evidence is what I'm going to call the explosion of life. And many scientists, both evolutionary and creationary, refer to it as the Cambrian explosion. What's that? The very lowest interesting fossil-bearing layer of rock. It's called the Cambrian. Here in Wisconsin, we've got lots of Cambrian rock. But what we find, the fossils we find in there are amazing. And there are so many different kinds of life. As a matter of fact, every phyla, every body plan that exists today is found in these Cambrian rocks. This is a treasure trove of diverse life. Naturalists, materialists, evolutionists are baffled by this sudden appearance of all kinds of life in this very lowest fossil-bearing strata. Because below that, before them in their worldview, there are no other kinds, there are no links connecting them together. Where did they come from? And where they all come from? They're supposed to come from a branching bush. They're all here at the exact same time. No intermediates or links. This explosion of life, the Cambrian explosion, is exactly what the creation model states, exactly what we'd expect. There was initial great diversity at the very beginning. By the way, there's no such thing as simple life. Even what you'd consider the most rudimentary or simple fossil exhibits marvelous design. All fossil life exhibits great design. There are no simple organisms. Get that out of your mind. There's no simple cell. There's no simple organisms. There is great complexity. We don't see in the fossil record any progression from what Darwin imagined as simple to complex. All life is complex. That's predicted and stated by the creation model. By the way, we call it the fossil record. Why do we call it the fossil record? What is it a record of? Here are two choices. It's a record of origin, or it's a record of demise. It's a record of the appearance of life. It's a record of death. Is the fossil record a record of life or death? If the fossil record is a record of the origin of life, that's what the evolution model says, or is it a record of a cataclysmic demise of life that existed at that time? And that's what the creation model says. The creation model says the fossil record is a record of death. It's not a record of origin. It's not the beginnings of life. It's a record of death. Speaking of Chuck, did you know in an average living room there are 1,242 objects Chuck Norris could use to injure you, including the room itself? We have many, many, many fossil graveyards. Everybody calls them a fossil graveyard. Those fossils are dead. This is a record of death. The fossils are a record of death, a doleful reminder of God's judgment. They're not a record of the origin of different kinds naturally over time. They are a record of death. See, science isn't so scary. It's like when Zeb asked Zeke, hey, Zeke, what is 1/1,000,000th of a mouthwash? Zeke said, oh, easy. 1 microscope. Oh, right. They told me don't laugh at your own jokes. All right. What's the second evidence that you can easily share? The first, this great diversity of life at the very beginning. Exactly what the creation model says. Here's another one that we can look to the fossil record to. Multiple abrupt appearances. Throughout the strata layers, we find different kinds of type, different kinds of types. We find different kinds of life. And those fossil kinds are found abruptly, fully formed and functional, exactly as the creation model states. That's just what the creation model predicts. There are no intermediate forms. There's no progression from one kind to another. a starfish with no legs, and then one leg, and then two legs, and three legs, and four legs, and finally five legs. Nothing like that. For example, the oldest fossil starfish, what's it look like? Looks like starfish, of course. Oops. The oldest fossil starfish look like, thank you, starfish. The oldest fossil dragonflies in the record, what do they look like? They look like dragonflies. What we're saying is there's been some stability of the kind. God created different kinds, variation within the kind. We have some dragonflies in the fossil record that have a 3-foot wingspan. There's been some variation within the kind, but nothing between kinds. One more example. I bet you can do this yourself now. Fossil bats look like, of course, Robert Pattinson. He's the latest incarnation of Batman in the movies. Okay, the oldest fossil bats truly look like bats. Before we leave the discussion of fossils, can we talk about one kind of fossil? Dinosaurs. Oh man, dinosaurs are so interesting. What small person doesn't like dinosaurs, enthralled by dinosaurs? For sure. This is the Tyrannosaurus Sioux in the Field Museum of Natural History, 90 miles south of us in Chicago. Very interesting origin story of the finding of Sioux. You'll have to look that up on your own. Now, sometimes I know Christians are a little afraid of dinosaurs because they wonder, how do they fit with creation? The answer is easy. Dinosaurs are a created kind of life, just like all other kinds. They were created by God. Land dinosaurs on day 6, anything that flies or swims that we might categorize as a dinosaur on day 5. They're just another kind of life created by God. They're really not scary when you put it into the context of the biblical worldview. Do you know what you call a dinosaur that eats automobiles? A carnivore. Carnivore. All right. I know many of you know this one. Which dinosaur could jump higher than a house? All of them. Houses can't jump. See, dinosaurs are really not that scary. All right. So we've seen 2 evidences from the fossil record. Let's take a look at both fossil life and current life. One thing that everybody notices is there are similarities. Scientists call these homologous structures or homologies. Homo, same, homologous structures. I'm going to call them design similarities. What you see pictured here are the forelimbs of 4 kinds of life. These, can you guess what these are? This is a human being. This one here is a dog. This one here is a bird. This one here is a whale. Now, differences for sure, but the same kind of structural design. An evolutionary scientist looks at this and concludes, oh, this shows evolution. It shows common ancestry via common descent. The reason all this life shares this is because an ancestor, well, in the past, developed this naturalistically, and then it got passed on. There's a better explanation, and that's the creationary explanation. A master designer and engineer reused good design. All life had a common creator. All life lives in a common environment. We would expect a master designer and engineer to use common design themes, to reuse them when needed. We see this in human engineers. As a computer scientist, I'm not going to rewrite a sort routine all the time. I'm going to reuse a good one. A mechanical engineer is not going to figure out a different way to build a suspension bridge. We've discovered a great way to do it. These homologies are evidence for a common designer. That's a reasonable idea. That makes sense. I think that's easy to share and easy to understand. Fourth evidence can apply both to fossil life and current life, and that's the classification scheme, the taxonomy. Do you remember learning about this in biology? Tell you how old I am, there were only 2.5 kingdoms when I was a little boy, and now there are 7. Whew. Okay. This idea of genus and species, that comes to us from the Lutheran Christian creationary scientist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century. You've all heard Linnaeus' name, but they probably didn't tell you he was a committed Christian. And when he developed his classification taxonomy, he was looking for a way to organize and systematize the kinds created by God. He said, look, God created in kinds, we ought to be able to identify them. As we've seen in this conference, that's hard to do. You can't just look externally. Dr. Jeanson did a great idea showing that. And we also have to look genetically, molecularly, and Carl Linnaeus could not do that. Now think about this to help understand classification. How do you classify things? Anything. Do you classify things based upon their similarities or their differences? Let's see. Yep. Wheels, engine, window, doors. Yep, they're the same thing. No, they're not at all. You classify based upon differences. If there were no differences among the kinds, we wouldn't be able to classify. If evolution were true, why would there be any kind of difference between kinds of life? There should be one continuum. But yet, what do we see? We see something that biologists call discontinuity. There's a dog kind, there's a cat kind. Lots of variation and differences and diversity within the kind, but you can't get from one kind to the other. There is a disconnect. There's no connection there that relates them in any way. You see, today we have dogs and cats. We don't have dogs and dats and cogs and cats. There are not intermediate forms, as evolution would suggest. But instead, what we have is exactly what creation would suggest. There are dogs and cats, neither living nor fossils of dats and cogs. That's what creation predicts, since God says, reproduce after their kind. So what's the fifth evidence? Interdependencies. Have you thought about how interdependent we are among different kinds of life? The oxygen cycle, one aspect of it is plants take in carbon dioxide, give off oxygen. Most other forms of life, including human beings, take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. That's kind of cool how that works. Where did that interdependency come from? Did it somehow develop naturally? Or more reasonably, is this an engineered and designed feedback mechanism? Are these interdependencies something put into the creation by the creator? A very interesting interdependency is something called cleaning symbiosis. Cleaning symbiosis is, well, there are some fish that have teeth. Tuna, barracuda, other fish with teeth. You're familiar with that. One thing they don't do is they don't brush their teeth. And your mom told you, don't brush your teeth, you're going to lose your teeth. Well, how they don't brush their teeth, what happens? Believe it or not, these fish will actually go to the cleaning station in the ocean and have the gunk after lunch, I can say that, right? Picked out of their teeth by shrimp and other kinds of little fish that are at the cleaning station. How did that? The answer is that's a wonderful design. It's what an engineer calls feedback. Two separate things working together for a common purpose. Those are outstanding systems, but they must be designed. There's a design system that allows this mutualism between the fish that need to be cleaned and the fish that clean them. You can find lots of examples of symbiosis, mutualism, interdependencies in the biosphere. The last evidence, this is a great one. It takes a little thought. And if you're going to use this one, you need to investigate it a little more. But that's the idea of beauty. It's not just, some people say, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. You think that's beautiful? No. Here's part of the answer. We all discriminate between beauty and ugliness. We do. And although sometimes people could say, well, beauty has a survival advantage and Darwin would, no. In most instances, beauty is a hallmark of the Creator. Made in God's image, we can all discriminate between beauty and ugliness, and we do, and that's a pointer back to a beautiful Creator, not an ugly natural mechanistic process. See, science isn't scary. Zeb asks, what do you call an educated test tube? Zeke says, a graduated cylinder. Let's come back to another idea that Charles Darwin wrote about, and that's natural selection. Now, Charles Darwin did not dream up this idea. There was a huge treatise published by Edward Blythe, who had creationary leanings 25 years before Darwin wrote his book on the origin of species. And this idea was known before Blythe, the concept of natural selection. This idea is correct. It's an actual, observable, biological phenomenon, natural selection. But it doesn't show the origin of a new kind, as Darwin supposed. Instead, it shows how a kind survives over time. So natural selection is for the survival of a kind over time. It doesn't produce new kinds. Excuse me. This is the program put into our genetic material at the beginning by the Creator. So this is that second aspect of diversity. Originally different kinds in Creation Week. And since then, we've seen, because of the genetic aspects presented by our other presenters, well, I couldn't get out of that one, could I? That something else, some built-in diversity happens. Think of it this way. The original creation had great genetic potential to produce diversity within a kind. We see that today. Purebred dogs like these collies. I had a collie, boy, Candy the collie. I love our current dog, Boole. She's a Great Dane mix. She's the second best dog we've had. I think Candy was our best dog. She was very open. But there's a problem with purebreds. If you breed two purebred collies, their offspring look like collies. They all look like their parents. Little variation, little genetic potential. But at the beginning, God created the male and female of the kind with great genetic potential. We see this today. If you interbreed two mutts, you're going to have offspring with great variation. If you saw my dog, you'd say, that doesn't look like a Great Dane. She's 50% Great Dane. And then a little bit of Rottweiler, German Shepherd, Terrier, and 5 other things too. Great variation. That's natural selection. It was programmed into kinds of life to generate the diversity that we see today, not only for beauty, but also to allow survival. For example, hypothetical example, elephant kind. Some had bunch of fur, some had little fur. If the environment changes radically, those with little to no fur in a very cold climate would die off. But those with lots of fur would survive. So that variation allows the kind to survive. Focus on the positive. Show what's true about creation first, and then refute the errors of evolution if needed. So our honest skeptic comes up and has a legitimate question. Didn't Darwin prove that all kinds of life descended from a common ancestor? Aren't we all related? You could say again, clarify, what do you mean by that? And I always say, that's an interesting idea. May I share with you some evidence that I believe shows that God created the diverse kinds of life that exist? And then pick your favorite and go with that. Now, at other points in time, stating the negative is absolutely important. When Dr. Cherhati or Dr. Jeanson are debating a PhD evolutionist, I thank God that they are able to point out the flaws well and reasoned in the evolution model. We don't have to do that. We're talking to our friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members. Every evidence has 2 sides, or if you will, is a double-edged sword. It cuts 2 ways. We can imply the negative by stating the positive. We don't have to beat down evolution. No, that's wrong. We can instead lift up creation and accomplish the same goal. If we can show that homology is the result of a common designer, it also shows, common designer, that it can't be the result of common descent. Please don't forget this. Creation is a reasonable idea. You know, to listen to Bill Nye or Richard Dawkins, creation is the worst thing since Internet Explorer or Windows 95 or stepping on a Lego. But creation is reasonable. It's scientifically sensible and it's logically lucid. It's clear and understandable to anyone who considers origins and the evidence in our world. Isn't that what Paul said in Romans 1? Romans 1, verses 19 and 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. How? In the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Creation is reasonable because it explains the data and it has predictive power. The use of reason. God created human beings as rational beings. You know, some Lutherans think that Martin Luther despised reason. He did not. He just wanted to make sure it knew its place. Creation is reasonable, and it's okay to use reason to talk about creation. Isaiah, come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. After all, where does logic come from? It comes from God. This is what it says about Paul in Acts 17. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, the honest skeptics, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. You know, Luther clearly believed that reason could show that objections to theological doctrines are inconsistent. That's what he did in his Reformation. He really expressed a willingness to be convinced by rational argument. At Worms, right, he said, unless I am convinced by reason and scripture, I will not recant. Okay? It is reason, Luther said, that distinguishes Adam from the beasts. Reason is the image of God in human beings. Creation is reasonable, and it's okay to use reason. We saw that Chuck Norris doesn't read books. Well, Chuck Norris doesn't write books either. The words assemble themselves out of fear. That's funny, but totally unreasonable. We laugh because it is unreasonable. Just as we should laugh, at least to ourselves, when someone claims that our genetic code assembled itself. Our genetic code was originally assembled by God. Clear enough? All right, some practical advice. I shared a little bit of this with you in my opening remarks. Can I share a little more and hit this again? Because people say, well, now what do I do? You've told me all this stuff. What am I supposed to do now? Okay. Here's my practical advice. And folks, this could be all wrong. Take it for what it's worth. I'm going to use an acronym KEEP, just because I like acronyms. It helps me remember things. K is for knowledge. Learn about creation. Learn about creation. I got to show you something. Sorry. Where do I learn about creation? Start here. Start with your favorite study Bible. Pick a translation that you can understand, and realize any English one is a translation, from King James to NIV to ESV to all the others. Start with the biblical text. Read it. Then get yourself a good commentary. Here's Luther's commentary on the first 5 chapters of Genesis. I love this thing. This is so full of great information. Whoa, get a good commentary. And then find a good creation book. I just got this. I haven't read it. I should read it. Number of scientists from the Institute for Creation Research, Creation Basics and Beyond. Great section on the origin of diverse kinds of life. After this conference, we're going to read this and find out what I screwed up on. So, where's my first bit of practice? Gain some knowledge. That's why you're here at this conference. Don't expect that this is the end. Do your homework. Number 2, equip. How do I equip myself? Well, you put on the armor. That's Ephesians 6. May I read it to you? Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fashioned on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert, and with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. Equip yourself. Don't go into battle naked. Point 3, engage. Now it's time to go into battle. And of course, I'm talking about this as a spiritual battle, not a physical battle, and not a verbal battle at all. What does Peter say in 1 Peter 3? Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Engage. Isn't that Christ's last command? All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Final step may be the hardest. Pray. Really pray. Conference attendees, in your folder there, I printed out a little condensed copy of Luther and what Luther wrote on how to pray. And this is a woodcut. Here's Luther in the background and friends praying over the sickness of his friend Melanchthon. Ephesians 6, can I reread one aspect of that? We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil of the heavenly places, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. Colossians 1, Paul says, and so, from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will, in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to God, to the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered you from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. What follows right after that admonition to prayer, many of you know because it's a great verse about creations. Colossians 1:15, 16, and 17. He, speaking of Jesus Christ, Paul says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Praying is hard. We do it. Here's my final hot tip. Pick one evidence. Nobody knows it all. Anybody who claims to know all the evidence is deluded. Anybody who claims to know everything about one of the evidences is deluding himself. Just pick one evidence. You don't have to know them all. If they ask you about fossils or information theory or ontological recapitulation, you say, I'm sorry, I don't know. However, this I know. Can I share this with you? For example, my wife is an equine scientist. Horses. If questioned, my wife can share probably a dozen design characteristics of the horse's hoof, things that defy common ancestry, common descent, natural selection, any naturalistic explanation. She shows me all the time. She says, this is hilarious. This book talks about all the design of the horse's hoof, uses the word design. And then said, it just developed naturally from an earlier dawn horse. What? No. Pick one evidence, learn it well, engage with that. And please don't forget, what is the purpose of creation? The purpose of the doctrine of creation is to point to the Creator. The reason we do creation apologetics is not to win arguments, not to influence people, not to put a notch on our belt, not to pat ourselves on the back. The reason we do it is to point people to Christ. John 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness has not overcome it. Thank you so much for your rapt attention. I appreciate your willingness to gut it out and listen to even me at the very end of our conference. Personally, I have really enjoyed this conference, and I want to thank all of our presenters. And I want to especially thank Dr. Joel Heck for all the work and effort that he's put into not only this conference, but the Society of Creation also. Because I started a little late and I went a little long, I'm sorry I can't entertain questions here on the recording, but I'll hang around and ask questions. So again, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace until we meet again.